Hey folks, I want to welcome you to today's the second show of our Southwest Research and Extension Center virtual field tour. Again, we'll let you know, you should have just heard me, that we are recording today. So all of our conversations, videos, things like that will be recorded and available at a later date from this field tour. Just a couple of quick thank yous again. If you weren't able to join us in yesterday's session, big thank you goes out to our IT department, Bronson Lewis, who's online with us here, Dwayne Hunter, our AgCom department, Dave Deacon, and Ed. Now, Ed, bless your heart, I still don't have your last name, I'm sorry, but they did a fantastic job for us. And then, of course, our division administration, Dr. Randy Taylor in particular, point out a big thank you to all those folks for supporting these virtual field tours. It's obviously not what we prefer to do in terms of a field tour. We prefer to have you on the farm, or we're heading around to the plots, standing in front of the plots, talking and visiting, and we recognize that would be more engaging and more enjoyable in ways for us to do that. But given our pandemic situation, we're not able to do that this year. Hopefully by next year we'll be able to re-engage and do those in-person field tours again. So that's what we're hoping for. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. You've all been brought in. You are muted. As you come in, you do have the freedom to unmute yourself and ask a question. Our crowds have been small enough that I think we can handle that okay. If you want to unmute and ask a question, we'll be okay. We ask if you do that, though, to make sure to remute yourself at that point. I'll try to watch that along with Mike Schultz with me and Aaron Henson. We'll try to watch. If you don't remute, we'll try to mute you back so we don't get outside noise interference. And or put your question in the chat box and send it in. If you have a question for our two presenters today, we'll certainly we'll keep an eye on that from that end as well to make sure we address any questions that might come up. And then at the very end of our program today, we'll throw up a quick poll, which you saw me test a little bit earlier. It's a 5-question poll. Won't take you very long at all, just to kind of give us some feedback over the virtual field tour today and the sessions that are conducted, and let us know what you think about what we're doing as far as the work that's being conducted here at the Southwest Research and Extension Center. And I guess with that, I'll give one more final thank you that I didn't get. I want to say a big thank you to our research and station system, our field research service units. We appreciate the work, in particular the one here in Altus, where this work's being conducted. We appreciate the support that we get through that system. Dr. Chris Richards, the director and head of that unit, and Mike Schultz is our superintendent here at the station. We certainly appreciate all their support and the efforts that are ongoing here in terms of research and extension activities. With that, I think we're ready to get started here. Our first presenter today is going to be Dr. Jason Warren. Dr. Warren is a soil and water conservation management specialist in the Department of Plant and Soil Sciences in Stillwater. And Jason is going to be talking to us today about irrigation scheduling and irrigation drip systems, a degree of that. And so, Jason, I'm going to turn this over. Actually, first what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Bronson to cue up your video. We're going to play your video, and then we're going to have Dr. Warren join us live at the end of that video for any questions. So, Bronson, let's go ahead and cue up Dr. Warren's video and play that.
All right, so here we're at Altus in front of our drip irrigation study, and we've had a similar study out in the Panhandle for the last 2 years. This is the second year, but this is the first year for this study because this is only the second year we've actually had a drip system here in Altus. And so in general, we kept this pretty simple. We're looking at irrigation as a function of the evapotranspiration estimates from the mesonet. And we know with drip that we're certainly more efficient than what the mesonet says we are, so we start with a 90% of that ET plus or minus rainfall, and then we have a 60 and a 40% treatment, and that gives us a range of evapotranspiration replacements that we can then compare. And we also have treatment where we go 60% at bloom, or from squaring to bloom, and then 90% during the bloom period. And then we have a bell curve that Zeth Bird has designed. But just to simply talk about some of the things we see out here, first off, this is a variety, Next Gen 4098 B3XF, and we planted this on June 12th, so it's about, it's a late planted production. And then we started watered on July 27th at squaring. And the first thing I want to point out is where I'm standing here. This is a treatment that had 40% of ET replacement. And you can see that it's a little less vigorous as far as row width and height than the 60% or 90% treatment. So this got 3 inches of water, and then the 60% treatment got 5 inches of water, and then we've got a 90% treatment that got about 6 inches of water. And so we have this range, and one thing that we see, and we can talk about this year, is the soil water content. We've got probes in these fields, or in these plots, and the concerning thing for me, for one thing, is we don't have a lot of subsoil water use. In fact, it appears that the water content is going up in our subsoil, and we can see from the plants that we're getting some physiological response to the water applied, but we're just not seeing a depletion in the profile. And what I always like to see on my irrigation is some level of depletion early, and then as we go into the season, I want to start building that back up and maintaining it for optimum production, and then let it subside and drop the profile as we go past our productive reproductive growth, if that makes sense. And we haven't really seen that here, and we can show pictures of all that data someday when we're at a conference. But that's one thing I see, and this was irrigated the way I like to irrigate, which was on a 3 to 4 day rotation. And the reason I like a 3 to 4 day rotation is that allows, we put a slug of water out, and then we let it sit for a couple days and grow some roots and utilize that water, and then we irrigate again. What we found in the Panhandle, we've had a drip system in the Panhandle for about 10 years, more than that actually, but we've been working on it for 10 years. And what we find is that if we irrigate daily, we train those roots to the tape, and we don't as effectively utilize the profile moisture. So if we get into a situation where we're short on water late in the season, we don't have that profile moisture that we can pull from because we don't have any deep roots. And that's why I irrigate on a, I put the same amount out in a week, I just put it out in fewer days, in contrast to putting ET replacement out every day. I put it out like, instead of 3/10 of an inch per day, I put 9/10 out on one day, and then 3 days later I put another 9/10 out is what I'm talking about. And so we don't have that comparison, a daily versus a 3 day rotation. Next year, that's what we're going to do. We're going to have daily irrigation events at 3/10 or 2/10 of an inch per day, and then we'll reduce the amount of water we apply by irrigating fewer days, and then we'll have some other treatments where we're irrigating every 3 days with 3 days worth of water. And so that's what we're doing. Let me see here if I forgot anything. One thing, when I talk about 3 inches, 5 inches, and 6 inches as a percentage of mesonet ET, just to point out, on our mesonet, our season-long water deficit for this was 9 inches. Had it been planted in May, like May 15th, the season-long water deficit would have been about 13 inches. So we actually replaced, on our highest treatment, we replaced closer to 80% of the total seasonal water deficit with 7 inches versus the 9 that was the deficit. But had it been planted earlier, we would have probably put out about 10 inches. And so those gives you an idea of how much water we put out relative to the evapotranspiration that could have occurred, and then you can compare that to what you've done. Another thing is probe placement. That's always a question, and I haven't quite figured out what the answer is to that. On these, this is taped on 30 or 40-inch tape on 40-inch cotton rows, and so we have a tape every 40 inches. And what I did is, these rows aren't perfectly on top of that tape, so I put the probe to the outside of the plant row on the away from the tape, and I did that mainly because I didn't want to drill a hole through the tape. If you have 40-inch rows on 80-inch tape, my best recommendation is to put that probe in between your plant row and the tape. And if you're on 30-inch rows on 60-inch tape, I'd do the same thing. And that's what we've done on our drip system in the Panhandle. That's on 30s, or it's on 60-inch tape and 30-inch rows. And the interesting thing, if you look at probe data on drip versus probe data on like an overhead irrigation, with overhead irrigation you get this big spike of water because the entire surface is being irrigated. In contrast, you've got to wait for that water to move to that probe. So depending on where your probe is will affect the way that water curve looks. And the best recommendation I can say is to watch the trends. Watch the weekly trends. If that soil profile is getting wetter, think about pulling back on the water. If it's getting drier and you've got more water to put out, then put more water out and keep it on a steady keel where you've got good water content and good growth. And don't worry so much about the exact values, but the trends. And as we learn more and more about how the soil water moves through the soil to those probes, then we can improve those recommendations. And I think that's it. And one thing I want to make sure and do is Seth Bird's heavily involved in this, and he's been a good partner in helping me figure out cotton, because most of what I've done in the past is milo and corn and wheat. And then also the cotton support program here in Oklahoma. I really appreciate any time I get commodity based funding for my work. I try to do the best I can, and we'll continue to this and to do this and learn more on how we can improve the efficiency of our drip irrigation systems in southwest Oklahoma, as well as in the Panhandle.
Okay, and at this point we have Dr. Warren joining us live on our Zoom meeting here. Jason, welcome to the program. Glad you're with us today and appreciate your presentation.
Thanks, Gary.
Matt, your volume's a little low. Let's see, can you bring?
How about now?
There you go. There you go. Okay. So I'll start off with what may be a little bit of a, I don't know if it's a redundant question per your presentation, but as I listened to your presentation and you talk about the fact of utilizing that subsoil moisture and that it didn't look like we were utilizing it as well as we could. So if we work on this irrigation system and we try to get those cotton roots down deeper earlier on that, allow them to grow a little bit deeper down there with that, do you in effect feel like that across the season that we might actually be able to irrigate with less water than what we've done?
Well, that's the idea. One thing I'll point out about that data is after I put that presentation together, I looked at some other probe data from down there on some early cotton, and it showed the same thing. Early in the season prior to canopy, we were gaining water to some extent, and then once we closed canopy and those irrigation systems weren't able to keep up, we started to draw down the profile. But the difference between what I saw on some pivots near Tipton and what I see on the drip system in Altus is that while we were gaining water on the total profile on those pivots, we were still seeing evidence of soil water use at depth. But on the drip, we didn't see that so much. And I'm not sure if it's because we hadn't closed canopy yet and the mesonet is overestimating early season pre-canopy closure ET, or if it's something about that location, because we have the canal very close and we have a field right uphill from that could have been causing some lateral flow of water in the profile. And so those are all things that are important to consider. The concept of getting deep roots, though, it really provides resilience during the peak evapotranspiration. If we don't have a full profile of roots where we can utilize the entire profile once we get into the heat of summer and we're trying to fill bowls and everything, then that just puts us more dependent on the gallons per minute that we're able to put out on the ground or the inches per day. And whereas if we've got deep roots, then that plant has some more resilience, in my opinion, to drought. And we see this a lot of times. Years ago, I'd get called down to folks and they were struggling to keep up, like during the drought. And one of the challenges that guys had is that they didn't have any profile moisture, and then they didn't have any roots. And so they were living on how many tenths of an inch they could pump per day, and they didn't have enough to keep up. But with deep roots, you can more effectively keep up and just hope that it rains if you don't have enough capacity to replace ET.
All right, I see somebody's unmuted up there. Do we have another question? Out there? Okay, any other questions for Jason here? Okay. Well, Jason, I'm going to get you to hold. You're going to be able to stay with us right now and hold on. We may have some other questions as we come back around here for you and Solly together as we get through here. So I'll kind of keep an eye on chat, and we'll see what we're working with there in terms of other questions for you then. Okay?
Yeah, I was planning on staying through the whole session.
Okay, good. All right. Okay, well, with that, I'm not seeing any other questions at this point. So in chat, so we'll see if we have some others that come up that we can get you and maybe for you and Solly together on that. So I think with that, we'll move on to our next speaker then. Dr. Solly Tagvion, who is our Water Resources Extension Specialist in the Department of Biosystems and Ag Engineering from Stillwater. Solly's been doing work down here in the Southwest area for several years, both on station, but also on producers' farms as well. So with that, Bronson, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and let's cue up Solly's video and let's get it playing.
In the past few years, I've been involved in several research and demonstration projects, all focused on improving irrigation management of irrigated cotton. As you know, most of our irrigated cotton, if not all, is in the western part of the state where water resources tend to be limited too. So it's really important to improve irrigation management and optimize it in order to not only maximize yield and fiber quality, but also to conserve the limited water resources for future irrigations. In these research projects, we've had the opportunity to monitor irrigation management for a good number of irrigated cotton fields across western Oklahoma. And several of these fields have done a very good job. They come as close as possible to an optimum irrigation management, but there are also many of them that fall far from that optimum irrigation management, either on the over-irrigation side or on the under-irrigation side. And I'll give you some examples of either one of those extremes. So in west central Oklahoma, where cotton growers pump from the Russia Springs aquifer, we've instrumented several cotton fields for a number of years and monitored their irrigation management. And what we noticed was that almost all of them were under irrigating. Especially when you get into the middle of the growing season, when the cotton water requirement is really high. I think what's going on in many of those cases is that the well capacities drop and we're not able to keep up with the demand. So let's say in the middle of the growing season, we need to apply 1/3 of an inch every day. If the irrigation system, and most growers in that part of the state use overhead sprinklers, center pivot systems, and pump from the Russia Springs aquifer, if we get to the middle of the growing season and the canopy has grown much, you have a elevated crop water demand, and at the same time the groundwater levels have dropped, that could cause challenges. For most of the center pivot systems, the system is provided with a chart that presents the application depth based on the percent time selected on the control box. So you go with a specific percent of time, this is how much water will be applied. Well, those numbers in those charts are estimated based on some assumptions. They assume a pump and motor or pump and engine efficiency and a depth to groundwater. If the efficiency of the pumping unit is different than what was assumed in those calculations, or if the depth to groundwater drops below what was assumed, the number we get off the chart is not going to be accurate. So we may be adjusting that dial on a percent time that would give us, let's say, 3/4 of an inch, but in reality, we may get only 1/2 an inch or maybe less. So if the system is going around and irrigated every 4 or 5 days and only applying 1/2 an inch or 4/10 of an inch, which is something that we saw, while the demand is 3/10 of an inch, 1/3 of an inch every day, we are falling behind. And we also noticed that with the soil moisture, it was depleted, and it impacted negatively the cotton yield. Another point to keep in mind is in the middle of the growing season and towards the end of the growing season, the cotton canopy is also big. It's achieved its growth, vegetative growth. So if the amount of applications are not enough, what we are doing is wetting the canopy. A good portion of that applied water will be intercepted by the canopy and thus never reaches the root zone. So when that happens, we mostly get direct evaporation off of the canopy, not a whole lot of water percolating deep in the root zone where it can be safe from evaporation and used at a later time by the root system. So that's something to keep in mind. The growers in that situation may need to check their system, do some catch can tests to see what is the actual application depth compared to what they get off of the chart, and see if they need to adjust their irrigation management in order to address the issue of deficit irrigation beyond the middle of the growing season. We also have seen fields that have over-irrigated. You notice this by installing the soil moisture sensors and even just visibly observing the field. It's always wet, it's waterlogging condition, and we sure want to avoid that. The waterlogged condition, because the lack of oxygen in the root zone, negatively impacts the yield. The over-irrigation of water could also leach valuable nutrients below the root zone and out of the excess of the crop. The wet condition would also be more conducive for the growth of diseases and pests and things like that. Not to mention the lost opportunity of conserving some limited irrigation water resources. So there are several technologies that we can use to optimize irrigation management. And in our projects, we have tried to investigate some of these technologies and see how they work for our situation here in Oklahoma. What are some of the opportunities and what are some of the limitations? One project that we started this year and I'm really excited about is a project that we conducted here within the Altus Irrigation District in collaboration with cotton growers here, also scientists from U.S. Department of Agriculture. And what we did is we tested a product for irrigation management that's developed by an Australian company for irrigated cotton in Australia. And what's interesting about this product is that they bring in 3 different technologies for irrigation management. They rely on satellite-based imagery of the field. Every once in a while you get that spaceborne imagery, and they convert that into a map of crop water use that covers the entire field. They also have soil moisture probes installed at a field, and you can get information about water availability in the root zone. And they also have canopy temperature sensor, which we can use to tell if the crop is under a stress, the temperature goes up, or if the temperature is in the optimum range for generating the highest yield. When you combine these 3 different technologies, you can get a comprehensive picture of the irrigation management. This year, we were able to instrument about 50 fields, I believe, in this part of the state. The funding came mostly from the collaborating cotton growers. We also received some funding from Cotton Incorporated, the state and national programs, and some funding from Conservation Innovation Grant of NRCS. I talked to the cotton agronomist of the Australian company a couple of days ago. We looked at the data. What we can tell based on this information that we've collected, and we still don't have any yield data to look at that, but just based on the data collected, it seems like we could have waited on starting the irrigation season a little bit. And what that does is, especially in a year like this, when we had a fairly wet spring, we start the season with a full profile, and then if you start irrigating too early, we don't give the roots a chance to fully develop and expand into deeper layers of the soil. So we ended up with a shallow root system, or a lazy root system, if you will. And what the problem is, when we get into the middle of the growing season, later parts of the growing season, the demand really peaks, and we need to be able to deliver water, and the crop needs to be able to extract that water. The root system is not there to do that. So no matter how much water we apply, we could soak the top 4 or 5 feet of the soil, but if the root zone is shallow, the crop is not going to be able to extract that water because the root zone is just so tiny. And it goes under a stress, even though you see the soil moisture probe shows some moisture in the root zone, but the canopy temperature tells you the temperature is above the optimum temperature for that maximum yield. So you know that the roots are not doing the job they need to do. A few of the collaborators, I guess, waited a little bit longer to start the irrigation, and the data from the sensors showed that they have benefited from that because the temperatures of the cotton were much more favorable for a good yield. So as a rule of thumb, we always recommend to let the roots develop as much as you can, and that's always going to be beneficial no matter how much rainfall we'll receive during the season. If it gets hot and dry, then the root system is there to take advantage of the soil moisture, and if we get a lot of timely rain, it still doesn't hurt to have a fully developed rooting system. Irrigation termination is also important. The sensors can help us with that as well, but the good thing about waiting on starting the irrigation season is that if we ended up having an end of the season in August, let's say, that's very dry, we don't receive rainfall, then we probably have the water that was saved earlier in the season that we could still use towards the end of the season, extend that irrigation termination a little bit, and make sure that we have sufficient soil moisture before wrapping up the irrigation irrigation season. A study that we conducted here at the research station, the block north of this block, over 3 years showed us that irrigation termination plays an important role, especially in dry years when we have a dry August or a dry July and August. Then that end of season soil moisture plays an important role on cotton yield and fiber quality. So it's important to monitor soil moisture, monitor irrigation management, and make sure that we have enough water that if you needed to go a couple of weeks later with irrigation season, we can do that. We can provide that. I talked a lot about some of the technologies available and the project we started this year with about 50 collaborating fields. But these sensor technologies have their own challenges and limitations, so we have to be cognizant of that as well. Here at the research station in this block, we tested some of these technologies. We have here soil moisture probes, and we also have canopy temperature sensors like the one right behind me. And we had challenges with both of these technologies at this particular field. With soil moisture probes, the values we were getting off of the probes were too high, were not making sense. In some cases, the soil moisture was going up as opposed to going down. It seems like the crops were generating soil moisture in the root zone. And we believe the reason behind that is a very tight soil, high clay content, and a very high salinity level. These two factors are enemies of soil moisture sensors, and we have both of them teaming up at this field. The combination could really impact the accuracy of the soil moisture readings. So we really couldn't use much of those readings here. What we are doing is we're taking a lot of soil samples and trying to come up with specific calibration equations in cases where we have high salinity and high clay content, so we could convert the values off of the soil moisture probes. In case of the canopy temperature sensor, the challenge we had here is, as you can see in this part of the field, the canopy never closed. And that causes a challenge because then the temperature that you're sensing is not the temperature of the canopy, it's the temperature of canopy and the underlying soil that the sensor is viewing. So when you observe a very high temperature, it could be because of that underlying soil and not necessarily mean that the crop is under a stress. That could be a challenge. The canopy could be limited. It may never fully close for a number of reasons. The variety may be a short variety. The condition may be difficult in that season, very hot, dry, limited growth. The early application of growth regulator may cause that canopy to never close. So it could be a number of different things, but if the canopy never closes and the sensor is not looking at just the canopy, then that could cause some issues and the readings may not be valuable in that case. So that's one of the challenges. In case of satellite imagery, you can always have cloudy conditions and you may go weeks, if not months, before you can get the next imagery and really use that. So each of these technologies have their own challenges and limitations, and hopefully some of the research that we are conducting here can help us address these challenges. And one last note about the irrigation management. We have taken a lot of soil samples. We've dug a lot of soil pits when we are extracting soil moisture sensors, or when we just want to study soil profile and look at the soil compaction, look at the irrigation limits for irrigation management, the field capacity of the soil, the saturation limit. And one thing that we've observed is a lot of variability between different fields in terms of the soil condition. In some cases, we've been in a field where the soil is beautiful, the structure is really nice, you see a lot of earthworms, it's no compaction layers, and you can tell that the sensors all respond to irrigation events, even the deepest sensors, the water moves in the profile, and you move to the field that's just next door and you see that there's a compacted layer, the water is not moving deep in the soil profile. You also see that in the root development. If you dig up crops, you can see the roots are going horizontal and not really going deep, and that's causing a lot of challenges for irrigation management. So the soil condition plays an important role when it comes to irrigation management. Soil serves as the reservoir for storing irrigation water. So we want to make sure that our irrigation management is optimized so that we get most of the applied water in that reservoir, but the condition of the reservoir and its capacity also plays an important role here. So they go hand in hand in achieving an optimum irrigation management. I would like to thank all the funding organizations. I mentioned a couple of them, Cotton Incorporated, both the state program and the national program. They've been big supporters. And also Conservation Innovation Grant of NRCS has been also a big supporter, especially with looking at irrigation management practices for surface irrigated, gravity irrigated cotton to make sure that we can optimize irrigation management when we're dealing with surface irrigation and probably less control over the irrigation frequency and irrigation amount. I would also like to thank all the cotton growers that have collaborated with us this season and in previous seasons. We always learn a lot from them and really appreciate them allowing us in their fields and working with us to advance this knowledge of irrigation management. And also the staff at the research station here at the Southwest Research and Extension Center. They've been a tremendous help along with the extension educators in different counties, especially those counties where we have largest cotton acres. They've been always a big support in letting us all the issues and helping us do our job better. So I'd like to appreciate all of them.
Okay, and now joining us, we have Dr. Tagbion joining us here. Solly, you're on to where we can hear you, or can you hear us?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. All right. So Solly, as you looked at the technologies that you're kind of looking at this year, I guess one question I'd have, which one excites you most as you're looking at that in application down here?
All of them and none of them. So each one of them, as I mentioned, has its own advantages and challenges. I'm excited that we have all these tools in the toolbox, so we can look at the specific situation and figure out if a specific tool is more appropriate for that situation, or a number of tools, like the situation we had this year. If a commercial product out there can bring us more than one, that's always welcome, so that we could look at the irrigation management from different angles.
Okay. And we're trying to check here if we get any questions in chat or if somebody unmutes on us. Okay, I see Glenn, you unmuted. Did you have a question? Hey, Tom, I've got you unmuted. Did you have a question? Nope, you're back muted again. Okay. Well, Solly, one of the things that
Harry, have you got me now? This is Tom.
Okay, yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
All right, I'm on the road, so I'm trying to navigate this. Hey, Solly or Jason, either or both of you, on probe placement, seems to be a very critical issue. Jason touched on that a little bit, and would y'all kind of expand on that if you would, and not only just from flood, but from drip also? What are your recommendations today about probe placement on both of those irrigation practices?
I'll go first, and I'll let Jason respond after. Yeah, it's not a big issue under overhead irrigation or flood irrigation. For drip, it is a challenge where you place that probe. Some of the fields that I've looked at within the irrigation district, mostly, what I would recommend, and Jason and I think it was back in 2014, installed, I don't know, tens of sensors in the drip irrigated fields and tried to get a comprehensive picture of where the water goes. But my recommendation would be and I think Jason mentioned this, between the crop row and the drip tape, somewhere in between, because that's where we know their roots will go. And you don't want to be too close to the drip tape, and you don't want to be, especially if you do alternate rows, you don't want to be in the furrow that's not irrigated, doesn't have the drip tape, because that's not going to, there's no roots there. But that would be my recommendation. And then you can watch that over the season. You can watch the trends. I've had situations where I had one probe right next to the drip tape, as close as possible without puncturing the tape. That was very helpful in making sure that I get the irrigation sets that I intend to. So because it would respond to irrigation events. As soon as you turn the system on, you'll see the impact in the probe. You turn it off, you see the impact there. So that was very beneficial. And also because you usually get a lot of deep percolation right under the tape. So that was also beneficial from that perspective. If you had a deeper probe, a three footer or a 4 footer, you could see deeper layers and get an idea about deep percolation. But as far as crop extraction, somewhere in between the row and the drip tape, I would say would be the best location.
Yeah, and I agree. And I was looking at some of the data from Altus, the probe data again today, and where I put it, that tape is on 30 or 40-inch tape and 40-inch rows, and then the rows are slightly offset from the tape. And I put that probe to the outside of the row from the tape, and so and those probes really didn't respond like what you see if it was between the row and the tape, because I think the roots were pulling the water away from the tape before it ever got to the other side of the row, even if I was still only 6 inches from the tape. And Salih mentioned some work we did years ago. We actually took soil cores and washed the roots out of them, in addition to looking at the soil water content around the tape and in proximity of the row. And I don't know about the cotton data, because that student, she kind of disappeared, but on the milo data that we collected, the tape certainly brings a lot of roots. I wouldn't want to say that it moves most of the roots to that tape side of the row, particularly as you get into reproductive growth. Early season, not so much, but we sampled at boot, which would be the onset of peak ET for milo, and a dramatic movement of roots had occurred towards the tape. So that's where you want it. And you're gonna see different responses in different soils to the irrigation events. And my best guess is you want to be able to maintain a moisture and see that you're getting some moisture depletion or utilization at depth. But it's kind of a tricky deal. I saw some issues on one of the pivots, even with bubblers, where the bubbler was not actually dropping water on the probe. And I have some cool video of that, but that causes a similar issue on overhead irrigation. But you just really have to look at the trends, in my opinion.
So Jason, do you think with a tap-root crop here like cotton versus sorghum, where you got that distinct and quite large fibrous root system there, with the taproot crop, do you think we'll see more of those secondary and adventitious roots maybe move a little bit more towards the tape in that case?
And Salih, he may be able to comment, because he may actually have that data, or it may have evaporated with that student. But my expectation is it would. I'm planning. I don't know that I'm going to go through all the trouble of washing roots, because that's a pretty heavy toll. But after harvest, my intent is to pull a probe down there and at least do some observations of root densities. And if anything looks real interesting, I'll go through the trouble of washing them. But the guys in Texas, my recollection is there's data in Texas that shows what you're talking about, is that the roots train towards the tape.
Okay. Solly, I've got a question for you where you were talking about, is the company, was it from Australia, where they were looking at satellite imagery probes and canopy, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. I remember them at the irrigation conference that they spoke there, presenting data. And as you talked about the canopy sensors, and then you consider like in our situation on station where we're at 40-inch row spacing, and you were talking about canopy closure, do you think maybe that that we take more advantage of that system, because that system's intriguing in terms of canopy temperature and water utilization and efficiency in that plant when you look at that, but do you think we take better advantage of that if we narrow up our row spacing and close that canopy quicker?
Possibly, yeah, if that's something that fits the management of production, for other purposes, maybe not just for this purpose, but if that's something, I know talking to Mike, we were talking about that, maybe a 30-inch row spacing would be better. It would certainly help. The technology is also improving. So the same company next year, they're going to come up with a camera rather than a thermometer. And the camera will have the ability to differentiate soil and canopy pixels and only extract the temperature of the canopy pixels. So it's probably going to be a higher cost compared to this one. These thermometers are much, much cheaper than a thermal camera that's smart enough to differentiate between soil and canopy. There's the issue of the cost, but the technology is going there. I guess we had multiple issues going on at the same time, so it was not only the 40-inch row spacing. That certainly played a role, but that was not the only factor there. If it is possible to close the canopy from the irrigation perspective, even without the canopy temperature sensors, we recommend that, because then you shade the ground and you reduce evaporation, direct evaporation.
Sure.
So that's always a good thing from conserving a little bit of the water. And it also helps with canopy temperature sensor. I like this technology better because you don't have to, like we were talking about, where to install soil moisture probes. With canopy temperature, you don't have that issue. And depending on how high above the top of the canopy you are, you can be looking at a fairly large area, maybe a few yards by a few yards. So you get a very good idea. You don't have to worry about where the water moves in the root zone. But we have the challenge of, well, if the canopy is not closed or at the earliest stages of the growth when the crop is small, what do you rely on at that point?
Well, obviously, on if you're talking a drip system, making your rows in order is not practical because you've already set your tape and your rows to that. But if you consider it in other irrigation systems, then there might be some adjustment room to, from a infrastructure type standpoint, you might could adjust some of that with that. So I guess one question I'd have looking at that too is the practicality of this for a producer to incorporate in his field. Do you feel like that's pretty approachable for producers to be able to afford and get into their field okay?
Yeah, the cost could be high. We'll have to run the numbers and see what are the benefits of that. This issue of root expansion keeps coming up. Jason mentioned that in his presentation, and Brian mentioned that in his presentation about nitrogen use efficiency yesterday. I think it's something that we'll have to take a deeper look at and continue this research that we're doing. I would say if these sensors can help us achieve that optimum root expansion so that we could better use the available nitrogen in the soil and the available moisture in the soil, I think they could very quickly pay for themselves. But if they're going to sit out there and they're not going to actually change the management practices much, or if there's a situation where there's no room, the management is very good, and we've seen that a number of times. There are many growers out there have really good soil profiles, do a really good job of irrigation management. So in those cases, if there's not going to be much of a benefit in terms of nutrient use and water use, then yeah, maybe the investment is not going to be justifiable in those cases. But in many other cases, I think they could quickly pay for themselves.
Okay. Jason, I'm sitting here. I think the thing that intrigues me most about the work that you're looking at and with the drip system out there and everything is that I look at that and I think there's the real potential to really utilize our water in a more efficient and maybe utilize less water. Of course, somewhat dependent on the year and what's driving us that year in terms of environmental conditions. But what's the thing that intrigues you most when you look at this drip system as you think about work coming on down here in this area in the station? What intrigues you most or challenges you most as you think about that system?
Well, and just, I guess Tom's not on here anymore, but you know, we do pretty good on drip with a well out in the panhandle because we can manage how much water we have. The biggest challenge for me to wrap my mind around, and every year I learn something, even out there, and I've been doing it for 10 years, but down here is really how you match what the farmer needs to what the district is doing and what they need, and you know, trying to develop data and systems management type things. And Slee and I've talked to Slee about this a little bit and Seth a little bit about this, but if we start really moving water to fields as a function of crop need instead of just traditional timing, then we need to think about how that affects the district. And that's probably the most fascinating part, and it most likely will be the most challenging part, but I think that it's worth doing and collecting this data to see what we can do, is to figure out how best to irrigate the crop and then how to tie all the irrigation in the district together to where we can get it done on every acre, or at least some of them.
Well, it's definitely an ever-evolving system when you think about the irrigation in the district from years ago to where we're at now, the development of tailwater pits, conservation. Our producers and our system have always looked at how to more efficiently utilize that water, conserve that water, and take care of that resource. So I think the work here on the station is really important that you two guys are involved in, and it's going to be an ever-evolving process as we go across time. And I think one of those things, you know, Jason, is kind of what you talked about will go in terms of probe placements. You and Salik were both talking about. You can get out in the panhandle, and, you know, a lot of my background is around sorghum and corn. You consider that root system, what it's dealing with out there versus a tap-rooted system, secondary and adaptation roots, and how does all that begin to tie in, and what are the differences you look at? So it's a challenge. It's ever evolving out there, but I think the work's going to be very interesting on the station. And the fact that we've now got a drip system on the station to be able to look at that's a real benefit, and it was a big investment for the university to put that in there. And we're certainly appreciative of that and partners that came in along with that to help that system. So I'm not seeing anything else on chat.
Hey, Gary, can you hear me?
Yes, there you go. Yeah, I got you, Josh. Go ahead.
Jason, I just had a question. You know, because the district does limit water to a certain, you know, they don't release water until a certain time down there. Is there a point where drip just won't be able to catch up? Or do you think that they release it typically early enough in the year that drip will be able to, you know, kind of keep that even baseline compared to something like the flood or the furrows or something like that?
Yeah, well, and that's one of the many questions. We actually had a treatment in that study where we were going to pump at 90% and then turn it off. And we did turn it off shy of the district turning off. But had we had an earlier crop and been able to shut it off earlier before the district to simulate an early shut off, let's say. So, you know, if they only have 8 inches in the district versus what they have, you know, every year that varies a little bit, then we could see what it'd do if you push that entirety of 8 inches out early versus spreading it out at 60% of ET throughout the season. The challenge is if you're running at 60% and the entire system shuts off, then you're SOL unless you've got a tailwater pit or something big enough to deal with it. And that's where I'm getting at, is to conserve water, you know, you need to apply it at a rate that fits the crop need for each crop, not, and now Tom's back on here, but not the needs of the district. And so they're combating. To me, there's a little bit of not combating is a negative word, but it's the easiest word to use. There's a little bit of a challenge in dealing with what everybody's doing and what I want to do as an individual grower, because if I want to conserve water, but then we shut off late or shut off early, and I don't get rainfall after shut off, then I could really kill myself because I would have depleted my profile in my efforts to conserve water, hoping that I would be able to go to the end. Same thing happens in the Panhandle. If you're irrigating along and trying to conserve water, and all of a sudden the pivot, the tires and everything fall off the pivot, and it takes you a week to get it running, you have to be able to manage for that inevitability, as well as manage for efficiency. Does that make sense?
Hey, can I jump in there a minute? Y'all got me?
For sure.
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear you, Tom.
All right. Hey, I'm on the road. I'm sorry I fell off there a while ago. If I can jump in on that topic right there. Early on, as far as a drip practice in particular, at the start of this season within the irrigation district, I'm going to speak of what I know or what I think I know. I don't see that being a problem that the drip would suffer because we don't start the water soon enough, for example, because in 99% of the time, if not all the time, the drip farm is not going to need water any earlier than a flood farm. They're all going to need water basically at the same time. And remember, and this also ties into what Jason was just now speaking about, the challenges with the irrigation district and individual needs. We are self-governed, so the board will decide when we're going to, by policy, it decides when we're going to turn it on. And of course, that's when the crop demand is there, right? They're growers, so they're going to turn it on when they need that crop demand. And then also on the tail end of that. Now, Jason's right. If you're a guy that is watering quickly or lightly or trying to conserve water and you don't have as much banked up, so to speak, and we shut the water off from the dam and you just don't have as much in storage as your neighbor does, yeah, then you could be a problem, certainly.
But those kinds of things those are the fun things, because they're the challenging things that you got to think about when doing this research to make it practical.
Oh, absolutely, Jason. But again, because of that built-in challenge, as we keep calling it, within the district itself, that's the reality that your research has to function within. Otherwise, it doesn't work on the farm. And I know you get that, but yes, it's not as simple as saying, "Hey, you got a well out there, go turn it on." No, it's not that. It's not that simple. Back to the probe issue. That's where I lost y'all. So what getting from both you and Sally is you want to locate that on a drip installation between the row and the drip tape itself. One of the things that we saw this year that really appealed to growers that they're extremely interested in is that early season look at that root development. They are beginning to really buy into and believe that we got to establish that root, drive that root down. Will that placement of that probe where you're recommending, will that show a good picture of early root development also, as opposed to if it was right in the center of the row? Will there be much difference, or is that still a good place for that early season indicator also?
I would think so, because prior to irrigation, you're going to have just normal growth of the roots, and then once you start irrigating, they're going to train towards the drip, or at least that's my recollection of the root data we have. And so, you're on 40 inches, so you'd be 20 inches from the row. Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question. I still like it, because you're gonna see the as you see that the water being depleted early, deeper and deeper in the profile. It may be a delayed look compared to having it right in the row, but you still should see it. What do you think, Salih? You've looked at more probe data than I have.
I agree. I think that's still the best place. if it's possible and the price of the probe is not too high, if it's possible to install more than one, then we could talk about another location, maybe right on the row or in between the drip tapes to kind of get the two extremes. But if we want to go with only one probe at each location, I would still say, even for the purpose of watching root development, I would still say that's probably the best place to put that in there. Now, as you know, that changes also based on the soil condition from field to field, but as a general rule of thumb, I would say that's the best place to put it there.
Okay, well, there are guys who are very much considering 2 probes because that early season root picture is they're seeing that to be a very critical part of what they're doing. So y'all might study on that a little bit. If they are willing to install 2 probes, what would be your recommendation as to where to put those?
I would say with the drip system, I would say either right on the row or on the other side of the row, further away from the drip tape, but not too far away, because we've seen when you go too far away, then you get nothing. Yeah, I mean, I've seen that I wouldn't say not too many fields, but at least that I would say maybe 3 different fields. When you go too far, right in the middle of the 2 adjacent drip tapes, then you pretty much get nothing. So I would say maybe one right on the crop row, or just a few inches to the other side of the crop row. And I agree with you 100%. I think when we lost you, we were talking about this root expansion, and Brian Arnell talked about it yesterday with nitrogen use, and we talked about that a little bit. I think that's a very important benefit of having these soil moisture probes, to be able to really monitor early in the season where the roots are going, and if we have a deep enough root system or not.
So additionally, so with folks still out here just on drip, but let's keep in mind now that as you're looking at probe placement and as you're moving forward on further research, you really have 3 practices within the irrigation district itself. We have that every row flood, on 40s, every row is watered. Then we have every other row, and then the drip. And while there's 3 different practices, the every other row is looking like it's mimicking that drip quite a bit from what the probe's saying. But keep those in the back of your mind, that there are really 3 different practices as we are moving forward with this research on probes and canopy data. Please.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I would say that also seems like depends, the behavior of that alternate furrow irrigation also depends on the soil condition. Like at the research station, we have a hard pan at about 20 to 24 inches below the soil surface. So if you irrigate every other furrow, and then that water reaches that hard pan, and it probably goes sidewise. In a different situation, if the soil is, maybe you don't have that hard pan, it would certainly, I would see that, and I've seen that in the past, that it would behave more like a drip system. On the research station, is just very interesting. It's a different animal. But yeah, that's absolutely the case, and that could be, even though it's a flood irrigation system, the sensor placement could also become very important when you have the alternate furrow system.
Well, I appreciate y'all's input there, and Solly and Jason both. I want you to know that there is more than significant interest amongst growers. I don't know if you saw it this summer or not, but it's really growing on using the probe in conjunction with the canopy and the satellite. They're really beginning to, I wouldn't say understand it yet, but are really watching it. In fact, there were a couple of them that were beginning to make irrigation timing decisions based on that data they were seeing. So there's a lot of interest here in this technology.
Great to hear that. Thanks for the support.
Yeah, it's good to know, because as they use this technology and learn and see how things are happening in the soil and all that good stuff, that then they just it's food for thought, and it starts to give them more knowledge to work with than just running water. So I'm really excited.
let me add one more thing along these lines, which is as we look forward, and I'm looking at what the Australian interface, or what I could see, you know, where I looked at it on my desktop or my phone, what the data it was giving me, the information it was giving me. And then what I heard from growers throughout the season, early on, you know, they wanted to look at everything. But as we got into mid-July, into August, mid-August, they got so busy that they didn't have time to consume that. And what they're really asking for is, in my terminology, a fuel gauge. Tom, it's great that all that information's there, but I don't have time to look at it. What I really want is just something like the fuel gauge in my pickup. It tells me my tank's full, half tank, or it's empty. So as we're looking forward and trying to provide that data, a quick snapshot, let's think about that too. In addition to all the background material, but that quick snapshot.
Yeah, and that's something that I've talked to Tom Dowling about, and James Mahan is also aware of that. I think their programmers are working on that to come up with a dashboard that's just much simpler to look at. And if you have only 30 seconds to look at that, you can get the information you need. And then if you needed more details, then you could click on other tabs or other pages to get more details. And I've shown them different examples, because Jason and I have been working with different companies, Aqua, Spy, and CropX, and different one of them. And each one of them have come up with their own dashboards. And I've shown Tom Dowling different examples, so he has an idea. I think one of these companies was interesting. You had the fuel gauge on one side, and then you also had an estimate of root development based on different sensor reading at different depth. So you were instantly getting the two most important information in my mind right there without having to go through a bunch of lines and numbers.
Tom, were you okay? Yeah, I see you're muted again. Okay, all right. Good conversation, good discussion there. All right, let's see. Not seeing any other chat questions there on it. I'm going to throw up our poll for today's presentation. If you do have questions, you can still unmute and ask real quick. Solly and Jason are here. Put this up here and launch it for you guys. Okay, it's open for you folks to go ahead and fill out that poll right now for us. Solly and Jason, we want to say thank you to both of you for joining us today and being part of the program here today. We ended up having a pretty interesting discussion as we went on through the morning here. So appreciate you guys joining us.
Thanks, Gary. And thanks for everybody for tuning in and for the questions. It's always good to have questions.
Yep. Folks, if you see the poll there, I don't see anybody voting. If you're able to vote, go ahead and vote on that poll for me. That will leave it up here for just a few more minutes. If we have any other questions, anything else? Okay, I'm gonna let the poll run for a little bit here. Without that, I'm gonna go ahead and mute myself. We're gonna say thank you for joining us today. Our last session is tomorrow. Tomorrow, Dr. Josh Lofton will be joining us, and we're going to talk about sorghum and work we're doing here at the station. And then I'll be discussing Sesame herbicide project that I have going here at the station as well. So tomorrow will be the last session for our virtual field tour for this time frame. And again, we'll start at 11:30. Most likely we'll be done around this time frame, maybe a little bit earlier, so around 12:30. But we invite you to show up tomorrow, and Aaron Henson's going to be our moderator tomorrow for us in the deal. So, all right, it looks like we've had our voting, so I'm going to end the poll at that point, and I'll share the results with you. There you go on it. So again, thank you for joining us today. And with that, we'll go ahead and bring today's session to an end and hope everybody has a good rest of their day. Thank you again for joining us.